All right, so hopefully you now have Git installed. We're now moving on to what is probably the most essential section in this course. We're talking about some of the core Git commands. So there's going to be a lot in the critical column here. First, we're going to talk about this concept of Git repositories, repos for short. What are they? And then we'll learn a bunch of commands, git init, that's going to be critical, git status. These are things you'll use nonstop if you use Git. Understanding the .git folder, I'll say, is important, but not a critical thing. You could go your whole life as a Git user without really understanding it and what's inside of it. The committing workflow, a very important concept, sort of an overview that we'll do, and then we'll dive into 3 more commands: git add, git commit, and git log. None of them are terribly difficult or anything like that, but they are very, very important, essential to working with Git, and they'll come up throughout the rest of the course. So take your time with this section. Don't speed through it. Remember how much is in the critical column, because for future sections, that really won't be the case. So let's go ahead and get started. What really matters? Pretty much everything. Okay, here we go. All right, so as the slide says, it's time for a quick, high-level conceptual overview. I'd like to try and introduce things at a conceptual level first before we dive into the commands, but I also don't want to take too long. I know we just want to get to the commands. So in this video, I want to talk about the term repository. This comes up all the time when we talk about Git and GitHub, so much, in fact, that people usually just say repo instead of repository, save a couple of characters there. They're the same thing. So a Git repository is just a Git workspace. Installing Git on our machine is great. I have Git over here. Hopefully you installed Git, following the instructions in the course. I have Git, I can just verify it's here. I can check the version, sure. But that doesn't mean Git is active or that I'm using Git. It's just on my machine. I have to manually tell Git when I want to use it and in which directories. I have to create repositories. So anytime I want to use Git for, let's say I'm writing a new symphony or a novel, or I'm working on a freelance web development project, or whatever it is, I need to tell Git to create a new repository. So it's just a Git workspace with its own history. So every Git repo has its own history. They're not linked, they're not connected in any way. There are these like little encapsulated bubbles. That's why I have this jar on the right with some Git history inside of it. So we can have as many repos as needed, all with separate histories and contents on our machine. So I may have a bunch of folders, a bunch of different projects. Each one of these is a separate project. If I want to use Git, I have to go into each project folder and create a Git repository. I have to tell Git, all right, I want a repo in here, and in here, and in here, and in here. And whatever happens in those folders, whatever Git commands I run, whatever history I store with Git, they're completely separate and not connected. So this allows me to have different histories for, a symphony, an app I'm cloning, a movie script I'm writing, a startup idea, whatever, a novel, portfolio website, you name it. I can have as many separate repositories as I need. And to wrap things up, here I have 2 separate folders, 2 different projects on my machine. And I've created Git repositories in each of them, which I haven't shown you how to do just yet, but I just want to show you that they have separate histories. So one project is this large web application, a bunch of files and folders. This other one, so the first one is called Yelp Camp 2.0. It's a project from one of my courses. The other one is just animals. It's a single folder with one file, very straightforward, just a list of animals. They both have separate Git histories. They are distinct repositories. I can prove that to you in a couple of ways. I'll show you in the console here. You can see all of this history here is associated with this Yelp Camp repository. So lots of stuff. What that stuff is, how I see it, don't worry about that. If I go to the animals directory and I do the same thing, a lot less and different history. All the history is about animals. Another way to show that to you is through a GUI like Git Kraken. Here I'm looking at the animals history for this one repository. You can see, there's a decent amount of stuff. It all has to do with animal-y stuff. And if I switch over to a different repository, very different, completely distinct history. There's collaborators, it's not just me. And this is, it goes back like a year or more versus this animals one is a lot more recent and obviously focused on animals. Anyway, we'll learn more about what all this is and how we make these checkpoints and how to use a GUI and the command line and all that stuff in upcoming videos. But for now, I just wanted to explain this concept of repositories and just show you some evidence of different Git histories for two different repos. So that's all there is to this term, this concept of a repository. It's a Git workspace, and in the next video, I'll show you how we create them, how we instantiate a new repo. Okay, so now that we know what repositories are in general, let's learn how we instantiate a new repo using Git. And before I show you that command, I'm actually going to show you a separate, very simple command called git status. Git status will come up again and again in this course and just in your life if you use Git. It's a harmless command. It just reports back to you the status in your current repository. The thing is, we don't have any repositories yet, or at least if you're following along, we haven't made any. So if I run git status anywhere on my machine, assuming I don't have any repos, I get this message: fatal, not a Git repository. It's telling me you're not in a Git repo. So it's aware of what Git is. It's not giving me command not found. It's telling me, yeah, I know, but you're not in a repo. Versus if I am in a Git repo and I run git status, we see something different. Now what we see varies, and that's why we use git status. It reports back to us and gives us information on the current repo we're in. So we'll use it all the time, but for now it's just proof that we're not in a repo. But now we're going to learn our second command, which is git init. So this will initialize a new repository wherever we are in our terminal. So whatever directory I'm inside of will become the home of a new Git repository. So it's the equivalent of what this slide showed, or these diagrams, where we have some folder and we initialize a repo inside of those folders. We navigate to the folder. So in my case, I have an empty folder called basics. I'll have different folders for different parts of the course. I'm going to make a new directory. Let's say I'm writing a novel. So I'm going to go with my first novel. And then I'm going to navigate into there. This is where I want my Git repository. I want to have a new repo in my first novel so I can track the history, the drafts, the changes I make, all of that stuff inside of this project. And then I'm going to run git init. Before that, just to remind you, currently not a Git repository when I ran that command, git status. Now I run git init, and it tells me it initialized an empty Git repository in, and then it gives me the whole path to where I am, my first novel. Now I don't see anything here. We'll talk about what actually happens in the next video. There is something here. It's hidden, and it's where Git is stored. But before that, I just want to recap what we've seen so far. The command git init will instantiate a new Git repository for us wherever we are, whatever directory we're currently in our terminal, where we run that command. Also, this is something we run one time per project. So we're not constantly initializing, if we're working on the same project day after day, if I'm working on this novel for a couple of months or years, if more like my speed, probably years, we would run git init one time. Git init just enables Git in this one project, and then we just use that same repository day after day. That's kind of the point. We want that continued history. Anyway, now if I run git status, we see something different. So before, not in a repository, then we initialize git init. Now git status gives me something else. There's a lot of stuff in here we don't know about at this point in time, but we'll make sense of it soon. But it's just proof that something Git-ish is happening, right? Instead of this message, not a Git repo. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about what actually happens when I run git init. Where is the Git folder or files, or what information does it create? I don't see anything. All right, so we just initialized our first Git repository. Again, that's something we do one time per project, one time per repo. But what actually happened? Where is the Git in this folder? Well, I'm also going to show you the docs here as a way of explaining this. If we go to the Git docs, which is git-scm.com, I think I've already said, I never remember that, I just Google Git. And then if you go to documentation and then reference manual, you'll see some Git commands, including the one we just used, init, right there. And then it tells us git init creates an empty Git repository or reinitialize an existing one, but we really care about that first part. And you'll notice this about the docs. They're very thorough and often can be kind of confusing at times. There's just so much information, and it's not necessarily displayed in the friendliest manner. Anyway, if we read the description, it says, this command creates an empty Git repo, basically a .git directory with subdirectories for blah, 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 blah. So it creates a directory called .git. Now, if you know anything about hidden folders and hidden files, you'll know they all start with a dot. And there is a hidden folder that we're just not seeing in this directory where I ran git init. If I type not ks, ls, I don't see anything. But if I use the -a flag, that's one way of seeing all. I don't know if it's A for all, that's what I tell myself, all files, hidden and non-hidden. Now we see this folder .git. So if I wanted to, I could look at that. We don't need to touch it or do anything in there, but this is what we just initialized. So if I delete this, my Git history is gone. Now we can, back it up and put it on GitHub and stuff like that once we get there. But for now, just to prove this, I'm just going to back out of here. I type git status, as we already have seen. It tells me git stuff. I'm in a repo. If I back out one more level, just to be clear, now I'm outside of this folder. If I run git status, not a Git repo. Go back into my first novel, git status. Okay, so if I remove that folder, rm-rf, you don't need to do this. This is going to delete the entire Git history for this project. If I do that, I type git status, I'm back to not being in a repository. So that .git folder is where all the Git stuff occurs. That's what holds it all. So I'm going to run git init again, it's okay here because we didn't have any history, but we would have lost a whole bunch of stuff potentially if I did have history and I deleted that directory. So there's a reason it's hidden, so you don't screw with it. So that's all I wanted to show you here. That folder will be located in every Git repository you initialize. Here's this Yelp Camp project where I have Git. This is an existing project. If I do an ls-a, there we are, .git. And if I just take a look at that, there's a lot more stuff in this .git folder than we had in our .git folder because I've been using Git on this project. Here, we just initialized this and we hadn't really done anything. Anyway, in the next video, I'm going to talk about a common problem that people run into, beginners with Git run into when they're starting out new repos, and then we'll start learning the basics of adding and committing. Okay, so in this video, I want to quickly talk about a common issue that some students run into early on. And to explain it, first, we need to understand that when we have a Git repo, we initialize a Git repo, that's in one directory, right? In our case, it was the My First Novel directory. But Git is going to watch everything that happens in this directory, including anything nested further down as, child or grandchild directories and so on. So I could just quickly make some dummy folders. I'm going to delete these, so you do not need to follow along if you are. I'm just going to call this, let's say I'm working on the book. Here's the intro to the book. I'll cd into the intro. And then I'll make another folder in here. How about draft 1? Okay, so I'm 2 folders in, 2 levels deep, but I can still type git status. Whoops, apparently not. If I type it correctly, and I still get feedback that says, yes, you are in a Git repo. So it's not just this folder, My First Novel. It's everything nested in that folder. So it's top down. And that's important to understand for a couple of reasons. One, any files and folders and changes I do in this directory for this one project are tracked by Git if I initialize the repo like I did. But 2, it's important to understand we do not want to be initializing another repo inside of an existing repo. I made a warning sign to make this clear. We want to keep our repositories separate, and you don't want to run git init inside of an existing repository. It's not the end of the world, but at some point, things will go wrong. Git will get confused because it's tracking everything happening in a folder, and if one of those folders has Git also initialized, then it's Git tracking Git, and it just gets confused. So we want to avoid that, and the easiest thing to do is just make sure when you run git init, make sure you're not in a repository. And that's why I showed you to use git status first. So if I wanted to make a new repository, I'm writing a new novel, I want to have a separate history, I would try running git status. Oh, I'm in a repo. That should tell me, don't initialize a new repo in here. You're already in a repo. Go somewhere else. So let's back out a couple levels. Let's keep going. So I've backed out, and now I can make another directory, book 2. Go into that directory. Just show it over here. Here it is. And type git status, not a git repository. Now I can initialize. All right, so you just want to be careful of that. If you do happen to initialize a repo inside of an existing repo, I showed you how to remove that repository by getting rid of the corresponding .git folder. All right, so it's not the end of the world. It won't give you an error message, but you want to be careful. And in general, my rule is make a folder for a project and then initialize Git in that folder. So you don't want to have a Git repo on your desktop or your documents folder or on your entire machine that's tracking everything. You could, but most people prefer to have one repo per project. So always run git status, make sure you're not in a repo before you initialize, and if you do happen to end up with nested repos, you can sort it out by deleting one of the .git folders. Okay? While it is lovely being able to initialize a new repo, we still don't know how to do anything inside of those repos. But that's going to change because we're about to talk about the most fundamental Git workflow, the bread and butter of Git, which is committing. So just like before, we're going to start with a quick high-level conceptual overview and intro to the concept of committing, which is what this video is, and then I'll show you the associated commands, there's 2 that we need to talk about, in the next couple of videos. So let's begin by answering a simple question. What is committing, or what is a git commit? Well, early in this course, I showed these slides. I spent kind of a long time making them. On the top right-hand corner, we have a website that I'm building. And you can see as I progress, feature by feature, I'm building this site out and modifying it. And then as I go, as I make some progress, I'm adding these checkpoints. That was a term I used when I first introduced these. A checkpoint, a snapshot of my project and its new changes at a moment in time, along with a little message like add top navbar, or add first row of content, or finish bottom row of content, change to dark theme. Well, each one of these checkpoints is actually in Git what we would call a commit. I just used the term checkpoint early on before we actually start learning Git because it actually makes sense on its own. A commit doesn't really sound like much, at least in my experience. Anyway, a Git commit is one of these checkpoints in a Git repository. And typically, a single Git repository has tons and tons of these commits, one after another. And eventually we'll learn how to go back to earlier commits, how to undo commits, how to just take a peek at an earlier commit. But for now, we're just going to focus on making these checkpoints. How do we do some stuff in a project? How do we, add a new feature to a website and then make a commit? And then repeat. Do some more stuff, make a commit. Do some more stuff, make a commit. That is our goal for the next couple of videos. I'll quickly show you an existing repository that I have this is Git Kraken, YelpCamp 2.0. I've shown this a couple of times. What I'm looking at right here with this GUI is a list of all of the commits that I've made in order. And actually there's more than one contributor, so it's not just me. So you can see here's the very first commit, all the way up to some of the more recent ones. So there's over 100, maybe 150 at least, individual commits, and each one of them is a checkpoint in time, a snapshot of the repository and the new work that I did, the new changes, and it includes a little message like, refactor async error handler and post methods, or something very silly and boring like initial commits, or, add Mapbox CSS back to some style sheet. Whatever that message is up to me, but there is a message along with this snapshot of my project in time. Now, the next thing that's crucial to understand about making a commit is that it's not the same as just saving a file. It's actually, think of it as something that's built on top of saving files. We have to make changes first and save them to our files before we can even commit. So we might use the term checkpoint or save point, but we're not talking about just saving a file. That has nothing to do with Git. We save files all the time. But once we have made changes, we can then group them together into a commit. So on the right-hand side, I'm showing potentially a commit that I may have made that includes changes to 4 different files plus a folder called logos. and I can group that all together into a new commit. But first, I would have written some new code in one of these files and saved it, and then written more code in another one and saved it. Then I make that commit. And the next thing that you need to know about making a commit is that it's actually a multi-step process. It's not as simple as just hitting a button that says commit, commit, commit. Instead, there's an intermediate step where we actually call out the particular changes that we've made that we want to include in a commit. And this allows us to selectively make commits, which is really, really nice. For example, imagine I've been working all day or all morning on some project. I spent a lot of time working on this project, and I made changes to 7 different files. As you can see on the left-hand side, I deleted a file, I modified 2 files, I created 4 files. And instead of just making one generic commit that just says checkpoint right now, instead, I can actually call out some of these and group them together based upon the actual stuff that I did. For example, I might group together those first 3 changes. I deleted a file called team.html, and then I changed 2 files called about.html and about.css. Those were one thing that I did across 3 files. I added some new team members to our about page, whatever the about page looks like. So that was one commit. And then I can take these other 4 changes and group them together into a separate standalone commit. So this is what I'm talking about when I say there's an intermediate step. We can select certain changes and make a commit with those changes. So we don't just say commit, commit, commit. Instead, we're getting in there with tweezers and we're saying, all right, this and this and this. Now we're going to commit those changes. So to actually make a commit, there are 2 associated commands. And we're going to talk about the first one in the next video. It's called git add, and then the second command is git commit. And we'll use git add in order to highlight or select those changes that we want to include in the upcoming commit. So just to reiterate all of this, a commit is a checkpoint in time. It's a snapshot of changes in our repository. Eventually, we'll be able to go back to earlier commits, undo commits, merge commits. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do. For now, we're just focused on plotting ahead and leaving a trail of commits behind, a trail of checkpoints. And when we make one of these snapshots, one of these commits, we can call out the specific changes that we want to include in a commit. Rather than just automatically including all changes in our project, we can select them, that's the first step, and then commit them. So in the next video, I'll show you how to do that first bit. In this video, we'll cover the git add command, which is the first of 2 commands that we'll use to make a commit. And as we previously talked about in the last video, we use 2 commands because that allows us to separate out particular changes we've made. We can, I think I used the imagery of tweezers, we can tweeze them out and select them before we make a commit. So we can group things together. And this git add command is what enables that to happen. So once we've done some work, we've actually made changes, we then call those changes out using the git add command to stage them for a commit, and then we can make a commit. And in this video, we're focusing on the first piece. And before we can do anything with Git, we need to make some changes. We need to do that first part, work on stuff. So I'm going to do a quick demo. I made this folder, my first novel. I'm pretending I'm writing a novel. We have a Git repository in here as we initialized it earlier. So I'm now pretending to sit down. It's day 1 of writing my novel, and I'm going to do some work. And if I was actually writing a novel, I would probably start by making an outline. That's just how I like to work. I outline all my courses. So I just made a new file there, outline.txt. And I've opened this folder up in a text editor. I'm using VS Code. So here it is. It's just an empty file. So if I'm writing my novel, I'll put some basic stuff in here. I am pretending that I'm writing The Great Gatsby, just so we're upfront about that. It's now in the public domain in 2021. So yep, I'm writing The Great Gatsby. So I'm going to be writing part of chapter 1, so I start the outline. All I know so far, it's very early on in the writing process, is that we're going to meet some of our characters in chapter 1. I haven't figured out what else happens yet. So I'll save that file, and if I come over here and I type git status, we now have made some changes in this project, and Git notices something. It says something it didn't say earlier. Untracked files, outline.txt. All right, so I'm still writing. It's a little bit later in the morning. I've outlined, I need to meet these characters or introduce them in chapter 1. Maybe I want to start by actually fleshing out those characters. I'm going to make a file called characters.txt. So before I actually write chapter 1, I want to make sure I've hammered out the details about those characters. And I'm just going to copy and paste some stuff in I've written. Okay. So we've got Jay Gatsby, Nick Carraway, Daisy Buchanan, Tom Buchanan, just little bios about each character. And if you're following along, you can put whatever you want in here. And then I save the file. All right, so I'm done for the morning. I want to take a break before I actually begin writing chapter 1. So I've saved those files. If I head back over to my terminal and I type git status again, now Git tells me there's 2 files that it's aware of, but it's not tracking. Okay, so we've done step 1. I've worked on stuff. Now I want to make a commit with what I've done. Well, now we need to talk about a tiny bit of terminology. 3 different locations, or not actual physical locations: working directory, staging area, and the repository. Let's start with this first one, working directory. That's just a fancy way of referring to the directory, the place we're actually working on our project. So for me, my working directory is this My First Novel folder. And in our working directory, I have 2 files at the moment. I might have more. I could have 100 files in here. The working directory just refers to this directory where I'm working. Then we have the repository itself. This is the .git folder. Remember, there is a .git folder here, ls-a, there it is. Inside of that folder, at the moment, there's some stuff that's just there, some default contents. But once I actually make a commit, git commit changes what is in .git. It actually adds new commits to that folder. So when we actually make a commit, we are updating that folder, the actual Git repository. Otherwise, everything I've done so far is just in the working directory. And then there's this intermediate thing, this zone, again, not a physical location, the staging area. And this is where we add our changes to before we make a commit. So here's another flavor of diagram. We have those 3 terms, working directory, staging area, and repository. On the left side, in the working directory, you can see a bunch of changes that I've made. So hypothetically, I've been working for a while. I've done some, I'm working on a project, some web development project, and I've changed 7 files, and Git has noticed that. So I've decided, okay, there's actually 2 discrete things I was working on. And I'm going to make my first commit with those bottom 4 files that I changed. They have to do with the navbar. I updated the navbar, or I created a new navbar on our webpage. So I staged those changes first. And I do that using the git add command. Then I can make a commit. And then same thing for these other changes. I can stage them. Then I make a commit, at which point I'm actually updating the .git folder. So I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse, but this is really important. 2 commands. Git add is just going to stage changes so that I then commit them. And this git add command is pretty simple. It's git space add, and then 1 or more files, the name of a file that we've changed. And we can do more. We can do multiple if we separate them by spaces. Otherwise, we can just do git add file name. So over here, in my working directory, I have these 2 files, right? I've changed them. They exist. They didn't exist earlier, and Git noticed. And it tells me this. Let me make this full screen here. It says, untracked files, characters, and outline.txt. Use git add file to include in what will be committed. Okay, so why don't we do that? I'll add the first one. So git add, and I can do autocomplete if I type something and then hit tab. So git add characters.txt. Now let's type git status again. I haven't made a commit. All that I've done is stage the 1 file, characters.txt, to be committed, but it's not yet committed. So if I wanted to, I could make a commit now with just that 1 file that I changed, but I'm going to group them together because, I worked on them together. They have to do with one another. Unlike this example here, where I wanted to group things into 2 individual commits, I instead want to group everything on this project so far, just 2 files, into 1 commit. So I'm going to also add outline.txt, And then I'm going to look at git status. We always use git status. It can never hurt anything. It just reports back. And you'll see whenever we make a commit, those 2 files will be included. So what we need to do next is cover git commit. We need to learn how to make those commits. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the git commit command, which is the command we actually use to make a commit using whatever changes we have previously staged. But before we actually run the command, and I definitely recommend you don't run git commit just yet, I'll explain why. Before we run it, we need to discuss commit messages. Whenever we make a commit, Git expects us to include a message that describes or summarizes the changes included in that snapshot in the given commit. For example, when I grouped together these files, the navbar changes, I staged them. When I committed in this example, I added a message, add branded navbar. Or here, I changed 3 files, I staged them, I committed with the message, add team members to about page. So we'll talk more about writing good commit messages and what makes a good commit message, but for now, just know that a commit message should summarize the changes included in that commit. So over here, on our first novel, the project that I've been working on, these 2 files, these 2 changes, are really just the creation of those files. So a commit message might be something like start novel, or initialize characters and outline, or begin work on characters and outline. Nothing super detailed because it's a very minor commit. So now let's talk about actually running the git commit command. And again, I want to emphasize, I recommend you don't run it just yet. This is one option, git space commit. And this will make a commit with whatever changes have been staged. However, it's going to try and use your default editor, whatever your default editor is on your machine, and most or many students don't have one configured, which is problematic because it will open up in something called Vim, which is a very, very not beginner-friendly, very crazy, confusing editor in your terminal. And if you don't know how to get out of Vim, it can be very confusing. If you happen to get in there, it's :Q will get you out of there. Anyway, I don't recommend you run this yet. There's another variant. Rather than git commit, which will pop up your editor and ask you for your message, we can just give Git the message at the same time. So this -m flag, git commit -m, and then we provide a message in quotes. Git will use that message that we provide and make a commit with it, rather than this flavor, which asks us for a message as a secondary step. At the end of the day, there is no difference in the generated commit, assuming you type the same message. It's just 2 different ways of getting to that same destination. So I always recommend beginners start with this. You don't have to configure an editor. You don't have to worry about Vim or another text editor. All you do is provide your message and hit enter. Okay, so -m, I believe it stands for message, or at least that's what I tell myself it stands for. It makes sense. Git commit -m and then a message. So let's try it. Over here, I have my changes are staged. I'm ready to make my first commit. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Git commit -m, and then something simple that summarizes what I've done in this commit. How about something like start work on outline and basic characters, or maybe just main characters? Sure. Start work on outline and main characters. And then I'll hit enter. Okay. So now what happens here? Well, let's type git status. This is what I saw a moment ago. Changes to be committed, no commits yet. Now when I type git status, nothing to commit, working tree clean. So this phrase, working tree clean, means that basically everything I've done in my folder, in the working directory, Git knows about and Git has been tracking, and it's up to date. Everything is in sync. But as soon as I change a file, the working tree is no longer clean, which is not a bad thing, but yeah, that's all that it means. So I've now made my very first commit, first of many. In the next video, we'll continue by adding and committing and adding and committing. We'll get more practice. I'm going to stop this video here just to keep it brief, but just to reiterate, when we make a commit, we provide a message. I recommend for now using the -m flag to provide the message in line. Otherwise, if you use the regular old git commit command, you can run into some trouble if you haven't configured your editor. And I'll include a video to show you how to configure that if you're interested, but it's not something you need to worry about for now. Whatever message you do provide should summarize the changes that are included in the commit, and later on I'll have a video on best practices for commit messages. So that's it for this video. Next up, we'll get more practice doing the same process. Change something, add, commit. So now that we've made it through our first commit, let's repeat the process and hopefully speed it up. We'll do some work, we'll add some changes, and then we'll make a commit. So it's day 2 of writing my novel, or maybe it's afternoon of day 1, and I've come back from lunch. I have my outline, I've fleshed out the very basic characters, the 4 characters so far that I've included, and I'm going to start working on chapter 1. So I'm going to make chapter 1 just a text file. I'll just do it from within my text editor, but I could do it from the command line. It doesn't matter how. And I'm just going to save that file. Maybe I'll put something in here like chapter 1. Not sure what I'm going to write in there. And of course, if I go over here to my terminal, what do we expect to see when I type git status? Here it's telling me, as we've seen before, that there's an untracked file called chapter1.txt. Also, if I go into any of the other files, like how about characters.txt or maybe the outline, and I type something else in here. Let's just change a single character. How about Jordan? I'm going to make a lowercase j, and I'm going to save this file. If I run git status, now we see something new. It says there's a modified file, outline.txt. It doesn't matter that I just changed the case of a letter. I did change that file, and Git has been watching that file. Unlike chapter 1, which is an untracked file, outline, it's already been added and committed previously, so Git knows about it, and it says, hey, you modified that file. So let's say I actually continue to work, though. I'm not ready to do a commit or anything like that. What should I do? I'm going to start on chapter 1. I'm going to just copy some of the text from The Great Gatsby. This is all available these days online, free, and legally. So I'm just going to take some of this chapter 1. If you really want to follow along, you don't need to, but if you want to, I'll include this link. And then I'm just going to paste this in my chapter 1. Okay? Simultaneously, I decided I need to do a bit more on the outline. So I'll add some here. There we go. Here's a bit more work that I've done on the outline to match some of the stuff that I've been working on in chapter 1 so far. Okay, so I'm going to save both of those files. And then I'm going to go over here again to my terminal, type git status, and we see basically the same thing. The files have changed. I mean, Git's not telling me right now what has been modified in this file. There is a way for us to see exactly what's changed. But for now, all that it says is something changed in outline. So if I'm ready to make a commit, I have to decide, am I going to group those files together? And I am, because they both had to do with chapter 1 and the work I did on chapter 1. So I'm going to add outline.txt, and I'll do it in one go. If I separate them by a space, I'll also add chapter1.txt. And now if I type git status, we see that whenever I do commit next, both of these changes, new file chapter 1 and the modification of outline, both of those will be included in the next commit. So I'm going to commit, git commit -m. What's my message here? What did I do? How about begin work on chapter 1? Okay. And type git status. Quick, what do you think we'll see? We saw it earlier. Nothing to commit, working tree clean. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is a command called git log. And the git log command doesn't do anything. It's much like git status. It just retrieves information. And the information it retrieves to us is a log of the commits for a given repository. And in this repo, we only have 2 commits. Now, there's a bunch of stuff in here for each commit. Here is one commit. Here is another. And for each one, you can see the author, the dates, the author and the email are things that you can configure, and we did configure early on, so it just uses whatever your local Git has configured for username and email. Then we have the dates, and then we have the commit message. And then up top, this crazy looking thing called the commit hash, we don't need to worry about for now, but definitely we will come back and reference. And then here is the second commit. So at this point, honestly, git log is just a way for us to demonstrate that when we ran git commit, it did something. And that's kind of it for now. So it's the next morning. I am very excited. I know how I want to finish chapter 1. So I'm going to start by just adding more to our outline. There we go. So I'll save. Again, if you're following along, you can just change a single character and Git is going to notice. Now, if I type git status, right, it tells us, hey, you modified that file again. Next up, now that I finished that outline for chapter 1, I'm going to go back to the actual file and finish typing the chapter out, which again, I'm just copying from the real Great Gatsby. Okay, so I've got a lot more text in here. I just took it from the Great Gatsby website, and I'm going to save. And now I've finished chapter 1, I outlined it, and I'm ready to go through the same steps again and commit. So I always start with git status. And I'm going to show you one other option for how I can add these two files simultaneously rather than having to add them by name. If I do git add followed by a dot, I actually have a slide on this. Here we are. Git add dot will stage all changes at once. So whatever we have unstaged at the moment, they're not going to be committed. When I use git add dot, both in this case, but if I had 50 files that were modified, all 50 would be staged. And it can be useful, but also if you've worked on a bunch of things and disparate features that aren't necessarily ready to all be committed at once, it's much better to be surgical when you make your commits. But for now, I finished chapter 1, the outline had to do with chapter 1, so I'll add both. If I type git status, we can see both of those have been modified, and now I'll commit. Git commit -m, finish chapter 1. Great. Type git log just as proof, and there it is, finish chapter 1. Okay, so then I go to bed, and I'm having a real rough time with how long chapter 1 is. And I'm thinking about it at night as I'm in bed. I'm like, I really need to fix that in the next morning. I need to break this chapter up. So that's what I decide to do. I wake up and I move my outline around a bit to reflect my new changes. I decide that right here, I want to split my outline. So I'm going to add chapter 2 now starts right here. So I'm just going to move some content around. Of course, by doing that and saving the file, I've now dirtied our working tree, meaning that we have some changes that have not yet been committed. Then I'll go to the chapter 1 file. I'm going to take half of this, the second half, and cut it out of here, save this file, and then I'm going to make a chapter 2 file, chapter2.txt, and I'm going to paste that in there and save. So now I have updated chapter 1, I've updated the outline, and I've created a new file, chapter 2. If I saved all 3 files, which I did, and I run git status, Git tells us, hey, there's 3 things that changed. Really, 2 things that it knows for sure were modified, and a third untracked file that it's aware of. Vaguely, it sees that it exists, but it's not tracking the changes. So I'm going to add all of them, and we can use the same shortcut I showed you, git add dot, because they all have to do with the same thing. It's just the same piece of work. Something like when I commit, my message will be, split chapter 1 into 2 pieces, or something like that. Looks good. Type git status, working tree clean, and git log. We see we have a new commit. So it's time to get some practice with the concepts and commands I've covered in this section. So of course you don't have to do any of this, but I highly recommend you do, especially if you're new to Git and you haven't seen any of these commands before. This is an opportunity for you to get some practice. It's a simple exercise in terms of the content. The actual files we'll be working with are based around 2 shopping lists. So there is a link in the resources for this video. I recommend you open it up. It contains a link to this exact page that has the instructions I've typed up. So there are steps, a step-by-step set of instructions for what I'd like you to do, starting with make a new folder called shopping, initialize a new Git repo inside of it, make sure you're not already in a Git repo, and then make a new file called yard.txt, then make a second file, groceries.txt, make a commit that includes both empty files. So a commit with both of those files, and then I tell you the exact message you should use. And if you deviate from that, it's not a big deal. But anyway, I'm just putting it there if you want to follow that. And then make some changes in the yard.txt file. We actually add some content, and then we add some content to the groceries, and you can just copy and paste from here. And then make a second commit, including only the changes from the groceries file. And the message for the commit should say, add ingredients for tomato soup. Then make a second commit, including only the changes from the yard file. And that message should say add items needed for garden box. And then next up, we're going to make some changes to both files. We're going to add this line to the end of the yard file. And then in the garden file, we're going to change the quantity. It did say 2 bags of potting soil. We're going to update that to 3. And then once both of those are done, we'll make a commit that includes both of those files. And then you should use this message. And then the very last thing is to use some unnamed git command that we've covered to display all of those commits. And we should see 3 commits. So that's a set of instructions, hopefully straightforward. But don't feel bad if you don't remember the exact commands, right? You can always reference them. It's more about making sure you have the conceptual flow down of how you make a commit. Okay, so I highly recommend you try it and stop the video now because I'm going to just go through the process myself if you want to watch. But again, I really strongly as I can through this pre-recorded video, recommend that you try this on your own. And then if you get stuck, you can check out this solution. Okay, so step 1, create a new folder called shopping and init a repo inside of it. So I have an empty folder called exercises and I'll make a shopping directory and cd into it. Make sure it's not in a git repo. I'm not. So I'll run git init to make me that new repo. Then it says make a new file called yard.txt. So I'll do that from the command line, although you don't have to. But here we are, touch yard.txt. And then make another new file called groceries. Okay, touch groceries.txt. And then it says make my first commit that includes both empty files and then use this message. And I'll just copy that message, I guess. Okay. So now if I run git status, there are 2 files that I currently my repo is currently not tracking. So before I can make a commit, I can't make a commit right now. There's nothing to commit. I need to stage those files. So I'll do a git add groceries and yard. I can do them separately or just in a single line. Now I type git status. Great. I'll do a git commit because that was the next instruction using this message I copied. Create yard and groceries lists. All right, so now I have 1 commit down. The next instruction says in the yard file, add these 2 lines. So I'll copy that and I need to open the yard file. Technically, I could do this from the terminal, but I'm going to use, you could just go to your text editor and open the terminal, or open the file rather, or I can use the code shortcut if I'm using VS Code and you've configured that, code, and then I'll just do dot. That will open the entire directory for me in VS Code. And here it is, I have my 2 files. So in the yard file, I'm going to paste this, 2 bags of potting soil, 1 bag of worm castings, and then in the groceries file, I'm going to copy and paste this. Okay, and save both of them. And then it says make a new commit including only the changes from the groceries file. And this is what the message should be. So we made changes to 2 files, but we only want these changes in this first commit. So that's the groceries file. If we do git status, we see both of them have been changed. I'm going to add, I'll clear just to put this up top, git add groceries. And that's all I'm going to add. So this will be included in the commit, and I'll make that commit. I'll use -m and just do it from the command line in one go. Add ingredients for tomato soup. And now we see that we still have those changes from yard that are not committed. That's the next piece. Make a second commit, including only the changes to the yard file. And it should have this message, add items needed for garden box. So I'll copy that, git add the yard file, git commit -m. There we go, add items needed for garden box. And now we have no uncommitted changes. Okay, and then the next step is to add the following line to the end of the groceries file. So we need to buy a couple of seed potatoes, just potatoes that I'll buy from the grocery store. So it goes in the groceries list. Okay, and then also I need to update the yard file so that it says 3 bags of potting soil instead of 2. So there we go. And of course now if I type git status, 2 files, both of them have been modified. So now it says make a commit that includes both of those files. So changes to both files with this message. Add items needed to grow potatoes. Okay, So I can do a git, well, wait, I don't know why I did another status, I just did that. I can do a git add and then do both file names, or I can do a git add dot to just add everything, which is these two files. And then I'll do my git commit -m with that message. Okay. And then the last piece, unfortunately, I just realized there's a small typo here, is to use an unspecified command that we learned to display a list of all the commits. This should actually say 4 because we've made 4 commits. The first empty one, that's the one I forgot to count when I made this. So let me update that very quickly. That should say 4 instead of 3. Let's refresh. And there we are. You should see 4. Okay, so let's try this. Let's go over here, and the command is git log. And I should now see 4 commits. Here's the first one, create the empty lists. Here's where I added to the grocery list for tomato soup ingredients. Here's what I added to the garden or the yard list. And then here's where I added to both of them. And that's the end of the exercise. I hope that you're able to go through that and not have to follow along with me step by step, although there's no shame in that either. Go get more practice with this throughout the rest of the course. This is really, really the bread and butter of Git. Add, commit, add, commit. We do it all day long, or at least many times a day. Okay,